Good afternoon, everyone. I am Adam Porter. I am chair of the mediation section of the Beverly Hills Bar. I welcome you to this afternoon's program presented by the mediation section and co-sponsored by the litigation section. Our speaker will be Professor Stephanie Blondell from Pepperdine. Our topic is negotiation and gender intelligence, tips and techniques for everyone. I'll mention a few items before I introduce Professor Blondell. You will receive your MCLE certificate shortly after the program. Your certificate will also be stored in BHBA Plus, our members-only community. Please take a moment to complete the survey that is included with your certificate. I wish to remind you the Beverly Hills Bar has an approved mediator panel. This is a panel of experienced and vetted mediators. Mediations are low cost and in some cases free if there's a small amount which is in controversy. One can find information about the approved mediator panel under the resources tab on the bar's website, and there's a way to initiate a mediation online, and also a way if you have the interest to join the mediation panel. I now want to introduce our speaker. Stephanie Blondell is Associate Professor of Law and Practice at Pepperdine Law School and Associate Director of the Straus Institute for Dispute Resolution. She heads the Mediation Clinic and teaches a variety of other courses at Straus. She teaches the Women's Negotiation Academy and chairs the initiative between the Los Angeles Police Department and the Straus Institute for Dispute Resolution. Stephanie received her bachelor's degree from Brown and her JD from the University of Washington. And last year, Stephanie was awarded the Southern California Mediation Association's President's Award. So we congratulate Stephanie on that. And I now am pleased to present our speaker, Stephanie Blondell.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, thank you, Adam. I appreciate it. Thank you to the mediation section and the litigation section. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and then we'll jump into the presentation. I am here as one of you, a lawyer who's interested and a mediator who's interested in issues of gender. And I'm hoping that I will raise some issues, ask some questions, maybe I'll have some answers. If not, I'm hoping that we get some good and rich engagement from the chat in terms of providing ideas, options, and answers. I've been at Pepperdine for 10 years. Prior to that, I ran employment and labor mediation programs. So that's my background, and you'll probably see that's partially the lens through which I teach. Okay, negotiation and gender intelligence, tips and techniques for everyone. Let me first start by saying that this presentation is geared toward two contexts, both bias elimination in the profession and the negotiation and mediation room. Okay, so part of the research we're going to be looking at is about women and the profession of lawyering. And part of the skills and techniques we will be looking at are gender differences in the negotiation room. So those are the two things that I'm hoping to focus on. Before we even start, let's look at some language and some caveats and a little bit of a statement of the problem. Because when I say women, that already is probably a moment for some folks. So when we're talking about gender intelligence in the field of negotiation, we're looking at a wide range of people who identify on the gender spectrum in different places, from women to men to non-binary. And so I often will use the shorthand of woman and man to capture an archetype, but please hear me as including all experiences on the gender spectrum. The research, frankly, does not support that yet, but it will at some point. And until then, this discussion and this conversation should support that. Okay, so that's one caveat. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is how this presentation came about. I came into the academy 10 years ago. I was teaching at a law school for the first time. And my students were reporting that they didn't really experience gender differences out in the workplace. I think that the millennial student had a different experience than I did as a Generation Xer, certainly the boomers before me. And it didn't seem to make a difference to them, but they would come into my office and routinely, at the moment that they were given an offer, and it was a moment to negotiate salary, I saw routinely that the women didn't negotiate salary and that the men tended to. Okay, there was a pattern there. I also saw women applying for fewer jobs because they felt like they weren't qualified. So in terms of the law school environment, I could feel that there was still a sense of bias, a sense of inequity, even though I think there had been a number of advancements in the field of law, including there being more female lawyers than men in law schools today being trained typically it's over 50% women. So this is the impetus, me wanting to, of course, make an impact, leave a legacy, and create a better experience for women lawyers generally. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll get started in the PowerPoint presentation and talk a little bit about what is gender intelligence. What does that term mean? I borrow, before I do that, I'm going to do the agenda and then we'll talk about gender intelligence. Today, I'm going to talk about a statement of the quote unquote problem, some statements of the solution. We'll look a little bit at a field called neurocollaboration. I feel like right now people put neuro at the beginning of everything, including, I've heard quite a few jokes about neuro trash, but we put neuro at the beginning of every field: neurobiology, neuropsychology, neurocollaboration. And we'll look at a few tenets of negotiation that I hope are helpful for you, both in managing the practice and our profession, as well as the negotiation room. Now, the first thing I've shown here is arguably, some people may find it funny, some people may not find it funny, an offensive cartoon meme that you can find. If you Google male and female brain, you will find myriad cartoons similar to this one, where there are characterizations made of men and women as different in terms of how they think and in terms of how they negotiate. I put that out there as a statement of perhaps the problem and perhaps the solution, and you'll see why in a moment. The way that I think about gender is that there are differences in genders and we misunderstand their origin, impact, and import. We see differences and we misunderstand their origin, impact, and import. And likewise, we may not see differences in gender and misunderstand their origin, impact, and import. And I will talk more about that when we get to some of the brain scan conversations about the difference between men and women. Barbara Annis has a book called Gender Intelligence I love, and she frames it as we need to change from great minds think alike to great minds think unalike. And I think that is a useful way of thinking about gender in general. I'm going to pause and talk a little bit about the source of the problem. And when I say the source of the problem, I mean the source of gender. Let's talk about the source of gender. So there has been I'll call it a war, but I'm kind of cautious in calling it a war, a difference of opinion, perhaps, between essentialism and social constructionism around the issue of gender for 30, 40, 50 years. So the essentialists would say women are a certain way, men are another way, and it is in our biology, who we are. The social constructionists would say this is not at all about our biology, but if girls were encouraged to play with airplanes from the beginning and not dolls, we would have more airline pilots. And likewise, if boys were allowed to play with dolls, we would have more boy Barbies designed, but that it's about the social construction. The problem with essentialism is that over the years, and I'll say the last 200 years, essentialism as a concept has been used to oppress people of color, women. Will measure the size of someone's brain, and then attribute that to characteristics. So the difference, I think, in the new way of looking at essentialism as opposed to the old way, and I'll go back to my gender intelligence slide here, is that the field of neurocollaboration has changed a lot of the ways that people are talking about essentialism. So they're actually studying our differences between genders in more complex ways with a lens of positionality and social justice in mind. And so there's been a resurgence of essentialism. Whereas in the last 20 years, it would not have been okay to assign too many gender differences to biologic variation. In the last 5 to 10 years, our research is reintroducing that aspect of looking at gender as a trope and as a negotiation trope. So you will see that I am using some essentialist kind of notions. At the same time, I'm using the social constructionism and talking about gender in the negotiation room. So just to make that clear, I think it's an important point before we go forward. Okay, so statement of the problem. This is framed largely from the positionality of women or gendered female. Okay, not very much research has been done on men. When we get into the new kind of essentialism that looks at the brain scans, we'll talk a little bit more about the experience of men, but it's been defined through the lens of gender. It's largely been defined through the lens of gender without taking into account race. So that's another interesting aspect of the research, and probably an aspect that is going to be changing. There's a big gap, and we need to be looking at gender through other positionalities as well, which would include ethnicity and gender fluidity and many other aspects of positionality. Statement of the problem, first one, women don't ask. That's one of the I think one of the biggest concerns that's both a myth and true. Okay, so what does this mean, women don't ask? When we're talking about women in the profession versus women in the negotiation room, there are two different answers to this problem. Do women ask? Studies show that women, when negotiating on behalf of self, ask less frequently, and when they do ask, they maximize less value at the table than men. Studies show that when women are negotiating in an advocacy role on behalf of others, they maximize as much value and in fact slightly more consistently. That slightly more that is consistent is not statistically very significant. So it's only a teeny bit more, but that often called mama bear concept, where women negotiating on behalf of others will maximize the same, if not more, and usually more value, is a different context than women negotiating for self. So first, let's talk about women negotiating for self, because our field shows this disparity. A recent study from NALP showed that there are less than 20% of women in firm partnership ranks. I think that's gone up slightly, but the number is minority women, 2.16% of the nation's law firm partners. That is a big disparity within our field. Likewise, women on the federal bench, there was an increase in the Obama administration of appointments, a decrease in the next administration. We'll see what happened next, but a dearth of women who have been appointed to the federal judiciary as well. And these types of trends are played out in the research, not only in obviously the field of law, but many other industries as well. There are consistent salary disparities. So I'm looking at a study from 2006. Male law firm partners make 44% more than female partners. 44% more. What does that mean in terms of numbers? 949,000 versus 659,000 in 2016. So that disparity continues and is one that comes from perhaps this concept of women don't ask or low targets, but let's talk about that. First of all, men don't ask either. I'll tell you, 50% of people, and I mean people, will accept their next job without the benefit of negotiation. Now, that may not be you. It may not be any of you out there, but 50% of people will accept a job, their next job, without the benefit of negotiation. And they will receive lower pay and benefits than the employer was willing to give. So that's usually about 10%. In many industries, tech, it's probably significantly more. I mean, every industry is a little bit different that way. There's a famous study that I find I return to over and over again because the data is good, even though it's old, but I think it will make its impact because the data is old, because the salaries will seem low to you. When men ask, they receive 4.3% higher. And when women ask, they receive 2.7% higher. Okay, just take that data as is. So if we're looking at a woman who negotiates once in her career and a man who negotiates once in his career, and we extrapolate that over a base salary of $50,000, which might have been your salary if you started 20 or 30 years ago, over a 50-year career with a mean annual pay increase 3 to 4% a year, changing jobs every 8 years, but you only negotiated that one time at the beginning. Once again, a 2.7% increase for women, and statistically 4.3% higher salary for men. And we look at what that means in a career. We find that men will receive $1,714,779 more over the course of that career. I'm going to say it again so you get it in your head. $1,714,779. Okay. The woman would receive $1,040,000 more over the course of a career. So we see that single act of negotiating for both the woman and the man created value in terms of $1 million plus, almost $2 for the man. So what we call this is the woman who doesn't negotiate early in the career has more stress because of this sociological dynamic, which is labeled the accumulation of disadvantage. The accumulation of disadvantage, excuse me. So over time, the stress of not having that extra income has impacts. I tell my students all the time now who are negotiating, but I don't need more. Well, you don't know if you're going to have an elderly parent who needs long-term care in an Alzheimer's unit, or you don't know if you're going to have fertility problems, or you don't know if you have a child with special needs. You don't know these things at the beginning of a career, and yet they create this impact. It's always funny to me. I joke, oh, wow, I thought the first time I saw those statistics, that'd be like a house in Malibu. And now I realize it's not even close to a house in Malibu, but it still is a significant amount of money. Both men and women experience negotiation anxiety. In fact, studies show that they don't differ that significantly about the amount of negotiation anxiety that they experience. It's just what they do with that anxiety. So men are more likely to negotiate with negotiation anxiety than women. So when women experience the negotiation anxiety, they're more likely not to negotiate. So in terms of our fields and practice, low targets, imposter syndrome, and negotiation anxiety are the final concepts we'll just go over quickly. The imposter syndrome, I'm sure you've heard about. It is a psychological, it's a description of a psychological experience that people feel where they're unable to internalize their successes. And regardless of the level of success that they've reached, they feel like they don't belong. And they look for social proof around them to see that they belong, and they may not see it because of the disparities in our workplaces. So that's a particularly interesting kind of dynamic, because it's not only women who experience that, men of color. And that imposter syndrome, I've heard many people report back to me that they've experienced from many backgrounds. It is an experience that you use to describe yourself. Recently, I read a great article saying, stop telling women they have imposter syndrome. It's not a tactic you use to try and engender someone to act in a different way. It's not a tactic you use to probably encourage people. It's descriptive of their own experience. I think there's a lot of other ways to coach folks rather than telling them that they have imposter syndrome. So here are some of the resources that, you know, are maybe helpful to you as you look at this concept of women in negotiation, but we're about to move into a slightly different area because we're going to talk about negotiation advocacy. I do have a slide here on the wage gap. I'll let you just look at that for a moment. I think it's interesting. Sometimes I hesitate to teach about the wage gap. I think it creates this competition that doesn't always line up with people's experience. But what you can see is white men for a, you know, on the dollar, white women make 79 cents, Black women 62 cents, Hispanic or Latino 54 cents, Asian women 90 cents, and American, Indian, and Alaskan Native 57 cents on the dollar. So that is not within the field of law. That is a calculation for year-round workers outside of our industry. So now, what is this picture trying to depict? And I didn't put the words up there because I think they're controversial. And as I say the words, I want to talk about them. There is something within the field of literature about women in negotiation called the female advantage. The female advantage. I think it's particularly essentialist and perhaps reductionist, but let's still get at the concept, even if we don't ascribe to it being called the female advantage. So there's a contrast on the left here with someone who is competitive, motivated by winning the prize, and someone here who is cooperative or collaborative during the ropes course, right? Who's found that a cooperative solution is perhaps either more comfortable or satisfying. I think that the research bears out that both for men and women, we get a little hit of neurochemical hormones or oxytocin or something good when we achieve the satisfaction of a problem, when we get to the end of a negotiation, when there's a solution, whether or not it's competitive and we've achieved, you know, we've maximized value at the table, or whether it's one of these elegant solutions where all the pieces have come together like a puzzle, like a Tetris game, and it's so deeply satisfying to come up with a collaborative solution. Both of those are satisfying. The tendency or the observation being made is that women may be more likely to come up with cooperative and collaborative solutions, complex solutions with many parts, and that men may be better at maximizing value at the table. So let's move into a little bit of a conversation about the female brain and the male brain. Okay, so
Stephanie, there's a question.
great.
Um,
And I'm not looking at the chat right now, so let me.
okay. So Lauren's asking a question. How do you know it's imposter syndrome versus actually just not having the appropriate experience? How would someone get out of this?
Yeah, okay, so this is a good point. I'll address that before we go on.
Thank you.
Imposter syndrome, well, I mean, I teach psychology of conflict, and one of the things that I watch a lot in the mediation room and at the negotiation table is this concept of projection, right? We're either projectors or we introject. Project meaning blaming out, introject meaning blaming in. And each of us does that in different ways. But the pattern of the human mind, and this is everyone, this is a psychological concept, is that you project out. And as soon as you project out, you kind of introject in. So you judge out, then you judge yourself for judging, and you judge out and you judge yourself for judging. Imposter syndrome is part of this loop. It's a very complex kind of concept. So you can say, and this will sound, I know many of you will resonate with this. Oh my gosh, I don't belong here. I can't believe I'm here. What am I doing here? What am I doing here? And then you go in the room and watch someone else do it. And you're like, what are they doing? They don't know what they're doing. I could do better. If I only had a chance. And then you get the chance and where am I don't belong here. How does this work? You know, and then again, you see that you are doing fine. And that reflexive loop is very much a part of the psychological trap of imposter syndrome. Part of imposter syndrome is reinforced by not having models that look like yourself in front of you in your workplace. Okay, so you had no one to show you, to normalize your place in the workplace. Okay, so I think part of getting out of it in terms of the antidote is understanding the reflexive nature of the imposter syndrome. Recognizing when I project out, they're not doing a good job, and when I project in, I'm doing a terrible job. They're not, is part of a psychological process that everyone who does not see themselves reflected in the workplace will experience. Let's normalize it. It is human. We were made with minds, which are projectors, and our minds work in these ways, okay? And so to me, I mean, Lauren, there might be a number of different ways to get out of it. I think community is one way. I think talking about the dynamic in the workplace is one way. I think talking about it in a way that's not blaming, because I've heard many women actually being recently reporting to me that they've been accused of having imposter syndrome. So it's turned into a tactic used against them, right? So talking to people about it in a safe way, asking someone who's about to go to trial if this is, you know, if they're afraid, well, let's talk about fears. I've had fears, you know, normalizing that kind of dynamic is one way out of it. If I haven't been responsive, Lauren, please do a follow-up question. I'm happy to answer it. So that awareness piece, in other words, I think is critical. So as we're talking about, I'll shift now to talking about the female brain, only because there have been a number of studies done in the last 10 to 15 years around, like I was referring to neurocollaboration and the way in which the genders operate. Now, I am a lawyer who loves to read about neuroscience. I am not a neuroscientist. Please hear everything I'm saying as a metaphor that will help you be a better negotiator at the table and will help you be a better partner in a law firm, right? Don't hear this as me knowing the ins and outs of neuroscience, and I please encourage you to pick up a book and read it yourself. But these metaphors I think are helpful. So fact, 99% of the male and female brain, the genetic coding is exactly the same. We are more alike than we are different in genders, 100%, well, 99%, okay, 99%. And so out of that 30,000 genes in the human genome, less than 1% variation. But those 1% make all the difference, right? That 1% makes all the difference. Please remember how similar we are. And this is an example of where essentialism has been used to oppress, like one example. The male brain is larger than the female brain by 9%. So for a long time, that was used to oppress women. You measure them and you weigh them 9% larger. Our current thinking in terms of science is that it's the exact same number of brain cells, but women's brains are packed more, they are packed together more densely and cinched together almost like they have a corset. And men's brains have these holes in them. They have the gaps and holes. So I don't know what that means scientifically, but I do know that that difference is, has been used in a way to oppress, right? There have been two different studies, one out of Israel, one out of the US, of these large scale brains imaging studies, SPECT imaging studies. And in one of them in the US, which was like 46,000 test subjects, there were a number of factors that were found. The other one in Israel was smaller, but I think more people turned to that particular research to talk about brain diversity, and I'll go to it in a minute, but I'm going to talk about the US study first, where many of you have maybe even seen Daniel Amen, who's on PBS. His book, Unleash the Power of the Female Brain. And he studied different typical aspects where male and females had more activity. So our science at this point has basically been almost like, it's limited to, if in a SPECT machine we put in dye and we look at something, if it's more active, we say that means it's working. Some point that may not be the science, but right now, if it's active and it's working, and therefore it must be bigger or better. Okay, so there are certain aspects of the male brain and certain aspects of the female brain that light up more and are more active. And I'll go through what those differences are in a second. The study from Israel is more careful to say no one has a male brain or a female brain. There are about 30 different differences that pattern in women and that pattern in men, but you would never have a person who had all 30 of those. There's so much diversity within the human brain that you might, if you're gendered female, you might have many of those, but still have many of the gendered male patterns going on. And so that there's no one, like less than 2% of people would actually show up with a majority of the gendered female patterns. Okay, so there's a real difference in terms of that, and I think an important point to make in terms of lack of bias. So we have both the SPECT machine and the functional MRI, which over the last 10 years has been the technology that allows us to measure brain activity, and it's taken us from looking at a moment in time, like I'm mad or sad or glad, or empathy is good. Empathy is a positive moment, and we can see that by this certain way that the brain is engaged, to what happens over time when people are in conflict. So we can watch people go from a snapshot, the picture we used to have 15 years ago, 20 years ago, to a video, right? And through that, watching this happen in video form, we're able to make patterns and make assumptions. The picture of the brain here, we have the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the anterior cortex, and the amygdala. And these are 4 areas of the brain that are often cited as being different for men and women. Okay, so I'm going to go over a few of them with a little bit of detail, but not the detail that those of you that are interested in, I encourage you to search it out. So women tend to have a larger anterior cortex. okay? And this is a superior ability to integrate, to arrange memories, to move complex patterns of thought into categories, to weigh variables, to consider options, to visualize outcomes. It governs, quote unquote, governs cognitive functions such as anticipation, decision-making, empathy, emotion. It's also sometimes referred to as like the worry center of the brain. So women tend to reflect. I think in its negative, that's called worry, okay? And it's positive, we would call it ruminate. And feel and express concerns more often and at a deeper contextual level with more connections made, okay? So the brain scan studies show that this aspect of the woman's female brain is more sensitive, larger, more active. All of those things that I said, you know, are technically how we're looking at better. Let's look at another aspect of the brain. We'll look at the hippocampus, which is the center for memory and emotion. It's larger and far more active in women, which, once again, this is speculation. That's speculation that women are better expressing emotion and intricate details from the past. So like the story matters more, right? What happened matters more. Telling, rather than telling, let's get to the punch, but telling the narrative of how we got there. This idea of women benefiting from telling their problems comes from this sense that the hippocampus is larger and more active. The amygdala. This is a part. Men and women both have amygdalas, and there's one on each side of the brain, and this is part of your limbic system. For those of you that know brain science, the fight or flight response, and it processes fear, triggers aggression, triggers action, stimulates competitiveness, things like that. Men react more quickly than women to stressful stimuli. Is this always true? No. But it's more likely to stay in the amygdala rather than to make the emotional connections to the stress. Men's amygdala tends to, once again, these are tendencies, tends to fire on the right when they're in the fight or flight response, and women's tends to fire on the left. And this is important because the right side of the brain processes gist or emotions, emotional events and meanings. And so you have gist. And for men, it tends to go to the bottom line, right? It registers on the left side of the brain. So you have gist, and then we have the details on the left side of the brain. And those are two very different ways of experiencing stress or trauma. Once again, instructive for those of us that are in the mediation room. Here's a picture of the corpus callosum. I don't know if you can see the difference between these two pictures, but what they're supposed to depict is that the corpus callosum, which is the nerve tissue that connects the left and right side of the brain, is thicker and more complex, more dense, and more overlapping, like overlapping highways, as opposed to the male corpus callosum, which tends to be more, the neurons tend to be smaller and they don't overlap. They tend to be more straight. Okay, it's this bundle of nerve tissues, which connects the two hemispheres of the brain. And the primary function is to integrate motor, sensory, cognitive function, all of those things, performance. So what does this mean? It means that women tend to, when you look at, once again, fill them up with dye and watch what their brains are doing, they tend to go back between left and right side of the brain. And the functionality of the left and right side of the brain more frequently and faster. And so you see these intersecting tracks that switch So someone once gave me the analogy, which I loved, think of LAX as a woman's brain and like, the Camarillo airport or something as a man's brain, right? In terms of the number of connections and switches. And you can see processing happen in that way. This last one, cerebellum, is an area of the brain that's usually larger and when we fill them with dye, much more active in men. Okay. And the cerebellum is motor control. Now, it also impacts cognition. So it's not just motor control. This is not just like women have more going on with the thinking and men have more going on with their motor control. It moderates precision, the satisfaction with precision. Of course, fine-tuned motor activity is part of it, but confidence might come more easily, comfort, certain types of reaction time, even verbal reaction time, though it monitors our motor control, fluidity, greater cerebellum kind of activity probably influences men to communicate more non-verbally than women, with an emphasis on certain types of physical movement or making points physically, right? Which can be seen as at times intimidating. This next slide, and I'll go through this quickly. I mean, it says testosterone and oxytocin. On top of the differences in our brain structures, there is so much that's going on with our neurochemical hormones, right? So we have testosterone and oxytocin here. This could be a couple hours in and of itself. But I will just say testosterone gets a bad rap. Women and men both have testosterone. Women actually experience larger amounts of testosterone at work, probably because there are fewer testosterone relieving activities like sitting around the water cooler and chatting that would, or excuse me, oxytocin type activities because of the competitiveness. So you see women's testosterone when studied actually really escalated in the workplace. Normal levels are linked to feelings of success in men. So testosterone is that hormone that allows us to feel drive and success. Oxytocin, I'm contrasting here on this slide, is, many of you I'm sure have heard of it, it's the social attachment hormone. It's nicknamed as the hugging hormone. It's produced when you breastfeed, when you have sex. There's been a number of studies about oxytocin. I think even Facebook has a study about oxytocin in terms of the amount of oxytocin that you experience when you hit like. And I think the result of that study is basically hit like. When we're on Facebook, we have increased levels of oxytocin, but only if we're hitting like because we feel a part of the community. If we're just watching it and experiencing this outward, this community is happening and I'm not a part of it, it can actually be quite alienating. But the oxytocin comes from the actual liking. So this has a lot to do with the way that we negotiate as well. A quick, just little interesting study here. Paul Zak, who's out of Southern California, and many of you may know his work, really brilliant scientist. He studied oxytocin in quite a bit of detail. And then the science reporter that's shown here invited him to come to her wedding, which I just thought was delightful. And she let him take the blood of the wedding party during the wedding. The short version is that, of course, the bride had the highest oxytocin in there. Then from there, it was the mother of the bride before we got to the groom or other aspects of the wedding party, which was interesting. Now, let's put all of this together. If we take, and I'm going to just move forward for time. If we take these two lists, they are summaries of some of what we looked at with the difference in patterning in gender in the brain. So we see people who identify as gendered more female, tending to be more contextual, more suggestive, tending to ruminate more, to de-stress in verbal ways. And then there is a certain aspect we didn't get to in one of the cortexes that's about reading facial expressions accurately. And we see that people that are gendered male tend to perhaps express themselves in negotiation as more unifocal, directive. There may be more of a focus rather than on ruminating or that imposter syndrome. There may be more of a focus on externalizing, strategizing. De-stressing is about nothing. And the example I give for that is, that there is, whether you're sitting on the meditation cushion, which is nothingness, or you're watching the baseball game, as a nothingness, that the de-stress comes out of kind of a blank experience, as opposed to a community or verbal experience. And reading spatial relations is an asset or a strength. Okay, so the left is more female, gendered female notions, and on the right, we have more gendered male concepts. Now, what does this mean as we move into negotiations? I want to talk about they're almost memes really, but 4 little memes that I think have been most useful when I'm training women to negotiate and men to think about gender in negotiations. Okay. And this first one is more for discussion. Men are promoted for potential and women are promoted for performance. That may or may not be true for you, but if you're a hiring authority, I always think it's a good thing to throw out there, whether you are a woman or a man. Think about how we promote and how we hire. The classic Heidi Howard study comes up here. So many of you probably are aware of this study where both men and women were given a job description, not a job description, a resume of someone named either Heidi or named Howard. Of course, the resume was identical. And both men and women were much more likely to want to work with Howard than Heidi, even though they were identical job descriptions. Excuse me, I said it again. Resumes, stuck in my head. Howard was seen as a team player, someone who was a go-getter, someone you'd want to work with. And Heidi was seen as aggressive and not collaborative. So the bias and kind of the hidden bias we have, all of us, men and women, is still significant in our culture. Another question I want to just pose, and if we have time, we'll come back to this. To what extent are you willing to use your gender to further your negotiation strategy? That is something I ask all women and men to think about. So, for example, are you willing to capitalize on being the dumb blonde and come out like a stealth bomb? Are you willing to do it in negotiations when you have an advocate, when you're the advocate and you're willing to maximize that or exploit that advantage when it's for a client, but you wouldn't do it for yourself? Are you willing to flirt as part of your negotiation strategy? I ask everyone that I work with in the academy, and it's both women and men, to think about this. Statistically, men are much more likely to use flirting than women in negotiations. But to what extent are you comfortable with that? I recently just had this come up this week where I was mediating a case with a student and there was another student watching it. I was mediating with a male student, female student watching it. And the female student was like, the client's in love with my male co-mediator, my male student co-mediator. Let's maximize that advantage. And I really had to pause and ask him, are you comfortable with the fact that you have high rapport? Do you want to use that? Is that fair to you? Is it fair to her? So there's all sorts of really interesting questions that I think we all have to ask ourselves. I suspect many women have maybe paused for a minute to ask themselves the question about whether or not they're willing to use their gender to further their negotiation strategy. If I'm looking at women over years that I've been teaching this, like I said, much more willing in the advocacy relationship than in just for themselves. But I don't know how many of you have asked yourself as men, to what extent? So it's a good question. I say write it down in advance, because otherwise it'll be situational ethics, right? You need to know. So an example of that, and you might, those of you that feel like writing it down right now, I encourage you to, because if we have time at the end, we might, this is what I'm hoping some people might put up in the chat. I'm willing to use my gender or flirting, let's say flirting, as a negotiation strategy when it feels like reciprocity, when it feels positive, when it feels like there's no victim, when it feels like it's not exploiting a power imbalance like around ethnicity at the same time, when I actually feel a sense of rapport and happiness around the dynamic, but not when it feels yucky, you know, something like that, you know, that simply those types of articulations I think are healthy, will help us remove some of the bias in our profession. Really interesting ad campaign here. This is out of a New York law firm. It's a defense, it's a women's defense law firm. And they won some ad, I don't know what campaign they won, but they won awards for this ad campaign. Ever argue with a woman is one of them. Labor pains, talk to us, we're women, we get it, right? So it's a really interesting women's labor and employment defense firm, advertising and using gender to do it. I have permission, I talked to the person, one of the partners who gave me permission to use these, of course. Here's another concept that I really want to put out there as we think about creating anti-bias negotiations, mediation rooms, and workplaces. Women are usually not just negotiating the deal, but the stereotype. And quite frankly, I've seen this is where women sometimes are not as skillful as negotiators. When they're trying to negotiate the deal, but they are triggered by the stereotype and they end up putting the two together, conflating them, right? So I think that those of us that are mediators, when we see that someone is using tactics of stereotype and there's a deal being negotiated, I think to the extent that you know, you feel comfortable, and I do feel comfortable, by the way, interrupting that dynamic, helping people see that there's one set of tactics you use when you're negotiating a deal, one set of skills, and there's one set of skills and tactics you use when you're negotiating a stereotype. And they're very different, and use each appropriately at the right time. So let me give you an example. When I'm negotiating a deal, I'm asking a question, I'm summarizing, I'm making an offer or a counter offer, identifying common ground or an interest, and anything else is fighting. The very few activities are actually negotiating, just that small category. When a tactic is being used, I probably have to either acknowledge the tactic. I can ignore it if the negotiation is still working, but I have to acknowledge the tactic, use humor to point out I see it, actually call someone on it, do a timeout. Simply sometimes making the distinction for people. I think we started negotiating a stereotype here instead of the deal. Let's go back to the deal, can really get people back on track, right? So that's something that I encourage. The other thing I want to just point out in terms of, you know, the statistic where women are so poorly represented in law firm partnership, I want to talk a teeny bit about likability. And so the second slide is women trade competence for likability. I'm going to speak a little bit about that. So studies have shown that men take their hit in likability when they go from being like a line or crew chief to the supervisor, just like when they're lower in the organization and they take a little bit of I'm supervising one person, that's when they take their hit. And then the further up in the organization they go, their likability tends to increase. Women have a opposite dynamic where the further up women go in an organization, the further down their likability goes. Now, some people have attacked this particular research saying that likability is not the same thing as cooperativeness, and they're often seen as the same. So for example, men who use authoritative leadership, they tend to be seen as likable, where women who use authoritative leadership are not seen as likable. Both, men who use cooperative leadership are seen as likable. More women who use cooperative leadership are seen as likable, but using authoritative leadership, there's a real cost for women. So there's something about trading competence for likability. At a certain point, if I'm going to be seen as more and more competent within my field, within my trade, I have to let go of the likability. And this is articulated as a double standard, it's not, a double standard, but it's articulated as a forced choice, as in you must. And of course you must not. Please be creative, figure out a way around that if you can. But statistically, we see this trend, and that's something that women are having to deal with quite a bit. I'm going to pause for a moment and look at a couple of the Q&A. And when I do that, I am curious if anybody is willing to reflect on their own comfort level with using gender in negotiations. Okay, someone has given us another great resource by Angela. I'm going to say Sinai. I don't know, might be Sinai. So thank you, Melissa, for that resource. I really appreciate it. Is anybody willing to maybe put either in the chat or I guess it would have to go in the question and answer. Either you have additional questions or answers, or you have a thought about using gender in negotiations. If not, I will just kind of give you my last few thoughts. Okay, so my last few thoughts are this. In terms of eliminating bias in our field, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to find those who are gendered female and experiencing workplace discomfort to reach out and make it a safe place, right? And that is about the rules of professional conduct ask us not to promote harassment, but let's go a little further. Okay, let's be mentors. In terms of the negotiation room, I think that as a mediator, simply understanding some of these patterns, understanding the way that women might have more narrative go along with a stressful situation than a man, has helped me to create understanding across that divide, right? I'm thinking particularly about dissolution, mediation. I'm thinking particularly about cases that have personal aspects to them, where I think that this can be used as a levelizer by simply you doing the right interventions to draw out people's strengths. I see Adam making some movements there, so I think we must have run out of time.
We still have a moment left.
We still have a moment. Okay.
Questions have come through here. Jay's asking if you can elaborate on what negotiating stereotypes means.
So I think it's, Jay, I'm talking about largely microaggressions. Let's see if I can give you a couple concrete examples quickly. So I'm negotiating the stereotype at the same time I'm negotiating the deal. Someone thinks that, and this happens to women of color quite a bit, right? But when I came in the room, they thought I was the paralegal and not the lawyer, right? Already I have, a moment of having to negotiate through a stereotype. So there's these extra external pressures so when I say negotiating, it's not the classic offer, counter offer. It's negotiating, meaning bringing them to the table. When I have someone say to me, Missy, which I've had, that feels to me like I'm suddenly negotiating this stereotype. When I have someone look at me, as I did early in my career, and say to me, are you telling me I need to suck the blank of management? That to me felt like I was in that moment negotiating a stereotype as well as a deal, right? So I'm talking about those types of dynamics and tactics that can be used. I know I have a friend who told me that she has a friend who will brush up against women, specifically, he's revealed this to her, in order to throw them off. That's negotiating a stereotype at the same time you're trying to get a deal for your client. So those types of things. And I'm sorry that it's interesting. I've used that term so much, Jay, that it didn't even occur to me how unclear it might be. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Professor Blondell. I know we're out of time here now. We thank you and are most grateful for your informative talk. And we wish everybody a good afternoon and a nice weekend.
Thanks, Adam. Take care.